and for the stimulating discussions we've had over the last day and a half here. So before I begin today, I want to thank the collaborators on this work, Shane DeWeese, who will be next speaker, Stephanie Ma, and Nicole, and the many, many people who came out and helped us on this project, which was quite labor intensive. Now, at the last Chaparral Symposium in 2018, it was sort of focused on this book, Valuing Chaparral. And in that book, we had a chapter, myself, Edie Allen, and several others, where we tried to look at chaparral restoration from a review perspective and look at what guaranteed success and what seemed to correlate with failure. But what we found was that there were very few published studies out there, and those that that included evergreen chaparral species as opposed to sage scrub really showed very poor success of establishment. So why is there poor success? And that gets to the part of my title, the complex problem. And to walk you through that, I want to cite a paper that Shane and Nicole and I recently published looking at the causes of type conversion or the correlations with type conversion, because that tells us where the places are on the landscape where we're going to need to do restoration. So we used a classification regression tree analysis approach here. And at the top you see, one of the most important factors correlating with conversion is southwestness. So what's the aspect of the piece of the landscape? And this is for eastern Ventura County. Then if we follow it down, what we're looking for are these blue bars. That means that the sites had been chaparral in the 1930s, and by the 2000 and teens, they had converted to grassland. So high blue means lots of conversion. So we can get to conversion in different ways. We can get there if you're on a southwest facing slope through low mean annual precipitation and being close to roads, and that leads to conversion. Now we can also get conversion in another way, and that's if you're not on such a southwest facing slope, you see more conversion if you are in an area that has winter high VPD, which is interesting. That's vapor pressure deficit. And that means not summer drought, but drought in the middle of winter is important. Then if there's high cover of grasses to begin with, you end up with conversion. So we can get to conversion in different ways, but the important point here is that converted sites are likely to be arid. And that means we're going to likely to be doing restoration in the most arid pieces of the landscape. The second part of the complexity problem is that the habitat is really steep. So lots of the places where we saw conversion were really steep, and in fact, this is one of our study sites here. So that means access is really challenging. Getting the plant material there, getting the water there is really challenging. The third aspect of the complexity of this problem is that the habitat is also heterogeneous. So there's lots of different angles and slopes and ridges and little heterogeneities that mean that there is no one-size-fits-all sort of solution. You can't just pick 2 or 3 species and expect them to do well everywhere on the landscape. So you have to tailor to the pieces of the landscape. Now, another problem, we've heard something about getting chaparral seeds to germinate. So getting plant material, especially if you want that plant material to be locally sourced, is another challenge. So for example, in the project that I'm going to introduce you to, we wanted to use chamise and Rhamnus salicifolia, redberry, and we had pretty good germination the first time we tried to propagate them, but then when we collected seeds again and tried to propagate, we got no germination. So that means we had to go non-local to get plant material. Other times we had other problems where we had, like ceanothus, 2 different species. We had great germination, but then when we tried to put them in containers that would force their roots to be deep, we had almost total mortality of ceanothus cuneatus. So getting your plant material locally sourced is really a challenge, or can be a challenge. Then the fifth problem, or the fifth addition to this complexity problem, is picking the appropriate species for the new conditions that exist at the site today and for the future conditions, which are certainly going to be hotter. All the climate projections and climate trends show that, and potentially more flammable. So the new conditions on most of the sites where we're working, here's one of our sites, and they're shading hidden in these tall invasive grasses. So anything you put out there, you either have to get rid of the grasses or they have to be able to grow with the grasses. And the environment is hot, and it's likely to be more flammable because of the prevalence of these grasses. So why put species out there that cannot handle fire? So we're not working in large part with obligate cedars. So enter Piru, California. In 2017 or so, we started working in Piru, funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. I put the sun over the eastern part of Ventura County because it is hot out there. This is not Maritime Chaparral. After Mike Vasey's talk, I was confused about whether the Sandy Ynez Mountains above Santa Barbara are Maritime Chaparral or not, but I can tell you for sure this is not Maritime Chaparral, and it is in the area of the Tataviam band of the Native Americans. Okay, these sites out there, they fit everything, all the complexity and challenges I mentioned. They are steep, they are arid, they're heterogeneous, they're grass dominated, they're flammable, and also the original community is not known for these sites. So this is an example of one of our sites. So we had to decide, what should the target species pool be? How are we going to propagate these? Can we get local material? And how do we maximize the success of establishment, particularly because we're trying to do this with very minimal watering. Our plants got 500 mils when they went in the ground. Sometimes they got a little bit more. Sometimes they didn't. That was it. So minimal watering and minimal landscape disruption. So we can't go out there and drill seed. Okay, so picking the community. We went out and we looked at what are the most common native species on the landscape today. And they all have this beautiful glaucous view to them. So these are the things we can find most prevalently on the landscape, sage scrub type species. However, there are sclerophyllous chaparral shrubs hidden around, such as this patch of toyon up here, some scattered roost up here, some ceanothus, oleganthus, one slope has some ceanothus cuneatus. So our three actually most common, what we might call remnant, more green looking species are Rusilicifolia, toyon, and interestingly, Sambucus nigra, or whatever they're calling it now. Okay, and then we can also find these three species in the Rhamnaceae, two ceanothus species, and Rhamnosilicifolia. So those 6 plus the ones I showed you before are sort of our species pool, but we wanted to go beyond that because we're trying to restore for the future, for this hotter, potentially drier future. So other species we took from the greater landscape, we could find a few chamise, so we used that, laurel sumac, just a few of those, and buckwheat as a sort of disturbance responsive, possibly easier to propagate species. So we basically had 14 different species we were going to experiment with. We also experimented with Hesperoyucca. I put Hesperoyucca and Sambucus kind of in their own category because they actually occur both commonly within chaparral and within sage scrub. And then divided the species into what we might consider sort of more sage scrub species, certainly more leaf turnover, softer leaf species, compared to our evergreen type species. So the approach we took before we did anything was to actually characterize traits of these species. So we measured these from leaves collected in the field. These are a bunch of relatively easy to measure traits compared to the physiology you're going to hear about later from Brandon Pratt. And we sort of looked at the relationship of these species to one another using a principal components analysis approach. So here's an example of one of our PCAs using 9 different traits. So you might think, well, this looks like kind of a gunshot scatter shot. They're not clumping necessarily really easily, but actually they do separate pretty well. So on the left side of this red line, on component 1, which is like leaf area and specific leaf area and some other things, we see all the sage scrub species on this side. On the right-hand side, and those include all the salvias here, sort of up here with Eriogonum, and the only more evergreen chaparral species on this side is Ceanothus oleganthus. It always clusters out near the salvias and the sage scrub type species, which is interesting. On the other side, we have the chaparral types, the evergreen sclerophylls, rhus and melasma up there, which are closely related to one another, up in that right-hand corner. And then our sort of xeric chaparral species, Adenostoma, Ceanothus cuneatus, and those down in that other corner. So they do kind of separate out in an interesting way. And also, Sambucus is always on its own. No matter what, we tried so many different permutations of traits. And I'm telling you, that stuff is different. It's just out there on its own. Okay, so then we took 3 different approaches. We asked, can some of these existing shrubs, like Malacothamnus, which is pretty abundant, be used as nurse plants? And this is work done by Stephanie Ma, who's in the audience here, who's in my lab. And then we asked, oh my gosh, I gotta speed it up. Okay, can we plant, we call this the landscape planting. What if we took all these species and we planted them across a diverse landscape, and we asked and measured a lot of aspects of that landscape? How do the traits of the species map onto the landscape? And can that help us provide guidance for future managers based on trait landscape matching? And then we planted in clustered plots, we call community plots, and we asked the question, does it work better to plant in a higher density? And does that matter based on the traits that you have? So I'm not going to talk about either of those experiments today. Shane's going to talk about number 2 in a lot of detail. But what I will say is that if we took both of those last 2 studies and we generate a performance index across the landscape, and we asked survival, so what % of each species survived, and multiplied that times how well they grew using height as an index of growth. And then we asked, well, how do these species on our PCA fit in terms of which ones grew the best? Okay, so what we found was, with the exception of Ceanothus oleganthus, everything over on that left-hand side of the principal components analysis these were the winners, the gold star species. So basically all of our sage scrub type species did a lot better than any of the green species. So on the right-hand side, we do have some silver stars, rhus and melasma, which actually did well for different reasons from each other, but they did reasonably well. And same with Sambucus, so it's sort of a silver star species. But our big losers are this group of xeric chaparral species. Okay, now I want to give a little shout out to Mark Borchard here. Okay, many of you might, some of us anyway, are old enough to have worked with Mark or to know Mark. And he made this nice little book of California Chaparral alliances. And one of his alliances is the Sage Scrub Alliance, dominated by Salvia and Artemisia californica. And we clearly showed, like so many other people, that these are gold star species. We can establish these well. Okay, but we can make a more diverse assemblage by putting in Hesperoe yucca and Salvia apiana and other things. But sadly, Mark pointed out in this kind of landscape where we were working in eastern Ventura County, we should have xeric alliances of Adenostoma and Ceanothus cuneatus, and we can find those, but we could not create those, so those were not winners. But within that alliance, he also lists some subspecies, and we did have some ones that we can put in that landscape, and that's Salvia mellifera. and Rusovata. So some general take-homes here. Like many people before us, restoring sage scrub can be done. And we found it was much easier than the sclerophylls. But what we did that was different from previous people is we used almost no watering. These plants went in during dry periods of time with very little water, and we got them established. So we feel pretty good about that. And we have higher diversity than the previously reported work on sage scrub restoration. But we think that Rus and melasma deserve even more attention, that they were actually pretty promising species for those, and getting to the future conditions, they are resprouters. So to me, these are species we really should be working hard to get into the landscape. So Shane is going to tell you that, or show you some data that sage scrub species benefit from higher planting density, but that was not true for chaparral species. And so is the future sage scrub? It's a hotter future. These are drought deciduous species. They're drought avoiders. Maybe that's the future in this hotter landscape that we're going to have. But that's assuming the whole environment is the same. And the next talk is going to focus to some extent on how the environment is actually heterogeneous. And therefore, don't give up. Stay on chaparral and stay tuned. Thank you.